Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and I'm the Dean of Graduate Studies at Charles Darwin University. Welcome to Outrider 30, Joan Didion and Magical Thinking and Writing. The originating project of this Outrider series was to acknowledge and to celebrate those human beings that are defiant, those human beings that are different, that dance to their own tune, that feel fear, sadness, pain, and loss, and do something powerful with that fear, with that pain, and with that loss. Not surprisingly, therefore, to celebrate Outrider 30, we celebrate with the legendary Joan Didion. Now, the literary biography is very easy to tell. Born in 1934, she died just before Christmas in 2021. She is a writer, an important writer. She was one of the pioneers of new journalism alongside Hunter S. Thompson and the legendary Tom Wolfe. She was a bright young woman and a very successful student in her BA degree at UC Berkeley. What made her unusual is during that degree, she entered a writing contest and she won it, and the prize was working at Vogue. And you could choose if you wanted to work at Vogue Paris or New York, and she chose New York City. From this base, she wrote for an array of magazines, including Life, including Esquire, including The New Yorker, and the New York Review of Books. Like the best of journalists, she took a word photograph of her time. She wrote about racism, she wrote about Nancy Reagan, she wrote about the relatively bonkers Latin American policy that was coming from the United States at the time. She summoned many firsts, including most importantly in 1991, writing the first mainstream critique of the racism that had caused the arrest and indeed the imprisonment of the Central Park Five, and noting Donald Trump's bluster at the time. That was an incredibly courageous act. So while living most of her life in New York City, she was born and continually returned to California. Sacramento meant a great deal to her, and her first novel was set there. And invariably when she wrote of America, with or without the capital A, she would return to the Californian lens of the United States. She came from a pretty complicated middle-class life, but she was lucky. She had a remarkable mother who believed strongly in reading and writing and the education of young women. Didion was also a reader, but what made her significant is she spent a lot of time connecting reading and writing. And famously, she retyped Ernest Hemingway's novels. And she retyped them to understand their language, their phrasing, their syntax. Now, this process, I think, captures much of her non-traditional education. She moved around a lot because of her father's job, and she was always an outsider, the new kid at school, and she never really made friends, and she was always excluded and on the margins, and that's going to be important in a second. But she did enroll in that Bachelor of Arts degree, majoring in English. Now, I love this because, this degree, the BA and majoring in English, is disrespected and discredited to such an extent at the moment. But she did this degree and her life was very, very successful. But she enrolled at University of California, Berkeley in 1956. And it was a remarkable degree program, can I say, because Sylvia Plath was also in the degree program at the same time, a couple of years her senior. So in 2001, decades after she graduated, she stated of her BA degree, quote, "The whole way I think about politics came out of that English department. They taught a form of literary criticism which was based on analysing texts in a very close way. If you start analysing the text of a newspaper or a political commentary on CNN using the same approach of close textual analysis, you come to an understanding in a different way. It's not any different from reading Henry James. End of quote. Now, I would disagree with her on that, but there's no doubt that new criticism, which she was taught at the time, that was the methodology, resulted in a hyper-interpretation of everything. But what it does do is create that deep understanding of nouns, of verbs, of phrasing, and of point of view. Her writing throughout her life would be linked with this new journalism movement, valuing style in and of itself, and nothing was too small to be analysed. So from this degree, she made a decision to be literary, to be a writer. She actively chose not to be an academic. And that's why she submitted that essay to that competition and ended up working in New York Vogue. Now think about it. You're 22 and you're working in New York Vogue. At Vogue, she learnt one key lesson: write long, edit short. There it is. She remained at Vogue for 7 years, and her friend Joan Didion helped her edit her first novel, Run River, that was published in 1963. They were friends at the time, and then they became lovers, and of course then they got married in 1964. And that marriage to Joan Didion would transform them both, just as his death and the death of their daughter would transform Joan Didion's final 15 years. Joan Didion died at the age of 87 in December 2021 of complications relating to Parkinson's disease. So through her career, she wrote 5 novels, probably best known for Play It As It Lays and the Book of Common Prayer, and her non-fiction, which was based in her journalism, particularly in her early books. She was an essayist, and so these early books were punctuated and filled by essays. We're now sort of the post-essay environment now, which is a tragedy, can I say. So her first non-fiction book was Slouching Towards Bethlehem in 1960. So 14 non-fiction books were published through her life, including Let Me Tell You What I Mean, the final book published in 2021. She also wrote 6 screenplays and plays. So through her career, she won a lot of awards. So the National Book Award for Non-Fiction in 2005, and in 2013, she was awarded the National Humanities Medal by Barack Obama. She also danced around academic life. In 1981, she was elected to the American Academy of the Arts and Letters. In 2006, she was elected to the American Philosophical Society, and she received an honorary Doctor of Letters from both Yale and Harvard. And of course, a really fine Netflix documentary has been produced for her and about her from her nephew, Griffin Dunn. Now, this was released in 2017. I certainly recommend it to you very strongly. And the title is, from a Joan Didion phrase, "The Centre Will Not Hold." Crucial. Joan Didion matters for many reasons, and she is important for those of us who read, who write, who think, because the centre will not hold. And as Didion demonstrated throughout her career, writing transforms reality. And it certainly transforms the view of reality for readers. She transformed our very understanding of sentence construction. And I would argue she has a great deal to offer us as researchers, as scholars, and particularly when we're thinking about the I in our writing. I'm asked about once a day from students, can I use I in my PhD? Can I use an I? Well, of course you can. And indeed, I often say that if you move into that dreadful third person phraseology, it can be obstructionary. So when people use that dreadful phrase like, the researcher has confirmed in this thesis, well, the researcher is you. So say I if it is you. But also, there are some key things we have to talk about in the use of the first person, in the use of the I. And when you use I, you must use it with care, precision, and punch. This is research. No one cares about your hopes and dreams. No one cares about what you're feeling. We care about your research questions, we care about your evidence, we care about your interpretation. Now, Didion stated of herself, quote, I belong at the end of the story, end of quote. Do you belong at the end of your thesis? So much of what we discuss in these Outriders has been about the edge, the margin, or indeed the end. Where do you belong in the story of your research? Therefore, that I, how you configure your sense of self, matters a great deal to your research. It also matters incredibly to research integrity and research transparency. Didion probed the very nature of writing and being a writer. She expressed in her book, After Henry, the challenges of surviving financially as a writer, but also the complicated relationships between writers and editors. She showed that writers gain a sense of themselves through the very act of writing, stating that, quote, writers are very rarely likable. They bring nothing to the party and leave their game at the typewriter, end of quote. Spot on. Writing is about choices, and Didion made some very important choices. Sarah Davidson described her writing as being, quote, in a voice I've never heard, end of quote. These choices were intentional. Didion described the importance of, quote, freeing oneself from the expectations of others, end of quote. Wow, I feel that today. Freeing oneself from the expectations of others. She also offered profound advice for those of us that want to write. She writes, quote, in order to find out what I'm thinking, end of quote. By the way, that's why we focus on getting our PhD students to write all the way through the program, rather than that dreadful phrase, writing up at the end. The worst researchers write up at the end. You write up on the way through so you can work out what you're thinking. Didion, through her non-fiction, demonstrated that truth is always temporary, it's always provisional, it's always available for revision. Didion wrote the first piece of mainstream journalism that probed that race-based bias that incarcerated the Central Park Five, an absolute disgrace. And she called out that behaviour to much personal cost. Her goal was always to investigate the status quo, to investigate tradition and ask why the world exists in this particular way at this particular time. The centre will not hold. Didion, for all her supposed smallness and frailty, was a very confident and a very cool writer. She delved into ambiguities and she explored life and death. She believed in books. She believed in reading, and wow, that's rare now. She believed in maintaining notebooks, and she always carried pieces of paper around with her as she walked around the world. Didion also worked incredibly hard. She wrote her first novel around a full-time job, and for her, writing was a job. She wasn't about being creative at all. Let's get inspired. No, she sat down and she wrote. Writing was and is a job, and she also separated writing and editing. Today is a writing day. Tomorrow is an editing day. She didn't blur them. She spent much of her life writing commissioned pieces. Now, why that's important is she was writing to fulfill the brief of other people. So that means that she learnt intellectual and stylistic discipline. She also had a great capacity to meet deadlines and was disciplined in her construction of every single word and every single sentence. Significantly, and the other inspirational bit of this story is Joan Didion wrote probably her best work when she was 70 years of age. The book was titled The Year of Magical Thinking. This year was triggered by the sickness of her daughter Quintana in 2005, where pneumonia became septic shock, and then she entered a coma. But of course, then also the death of her husband, John Dunn, on December 30. They were in the intensive care ward with their daughter. They came home. Joan was making dinner for her husband, and he died at the dining room table in front of her. This funeral was delayed until their daughter was released from intensive care so she could attend the funeral, and she did. But after that funeral, Quintana travelled to Los Angeles. She fell at LAX, the airport, developed a hematoma, appeared to recover from it, but then died of pancreatitis in August 2005, aged 39. These two deaths triggered her best writing, The Year of Magical Thinking and the legendary Blue Nights. She was able to mobilise tragedy and marinate her writing in despair. If you want to understand something of life and something of death, then read these two books. For those of us who have given everything to another human being, have emptied ourselves of life and given that to another human being, and then that person dies, how do we continue to live when the best parts of us are dead? Particularly for those of us who don't believe in gods and deities and reincarnation and, a better world is a coming. Those of us that don't believe in that sort of stuff, the waste and the horror of death is unfathomable in its cruelty. The Year of Magical Thinking, for me, is one of the books of this century. It is raw, it is precise, it is painful, and it's cruel. There are no happy endings. Our fairy tales lie to us. They trick us to think that life is going to be happy, that we're going to find joy, that we're going to find peace, that it's just going to be a lovely time. And you know what? We may for a while. But then there's a scorpion tail at the end. When we lose someone who we have loved completely, that we've gifted that deep self, so it's not even possible to see the join. And indeed, we empty ourselves through that joining. When that person dies, we are empty. We are a husk. We are a shell. We are a zombie. There's no desire to breathe in and out. There's no desire to wake up. There's no desire to walk. It is strange living every day through the gauze of death. in this weird limbo. You're sort of living, but you're carrying death around with you through that life. You want to die, but the body keeps moving around. The Year of Magical Thinking is a book about love and about loss, but it's also a book about marriage and writing. We see all the gifts of her writing when she explores the nature of grief, the attention to detail. She is rational. She is lucid, with incredible attention to the details about how memories are managed and organised after a death. You see, they'd spent their entire adult lives together. They worked from home. They were both writers. So they wrote together, they worked together, they lived together. And after his death, she wrote, quote, "I remember thinking I need to discuss all of this with John." End of quote. She captured the reality of so many of us, that we just live in the shadows of the living. Indeed, we cast a shadow on the living. And then, of course, her daughter dies. And then in Blue Nights, she dips her words into the broken, into the lost, into the wasted. From this broken and breaking life, she states, quote, "When we lose that sense of the possible, we lose it fast." End of quote. Beautifully, if unevenly written, Blue Nights is a book of deep, well deep loss. The loss beyond recovery. The death that continues to drag us through life. The great writers like Didion craft sentences that graze our emotional skin. And after we have read these words, that skin never heals. She states, quote, "I no longer want reminders of what was broken, what was lost, what was wasted. In theory, these mementos serve to bring back the moment. In fact, they serve only to make clear how inadequately I appreciated this moment when it was here." End of quote. But even in this darkness, she reflects on writing, quote, "What if I can never again locate the words that work?" End of quote. Now, I feel her work incredibly deeply, because when my husband, Steve Redhead, died, I died with him. I was with him at his point of death, 2020. It was 12:20 a.m. in the morning. And I acknowledge the moment of death. I can see it. It is a horror movie that goes in my head 24/7. And when he died, I didn't know if I had the life or the body or the strength to be able to breathe or to be able to walk away from that deathbed. And still, 5 years later, my first thought every morning when I wake up at 1 a.m. these days, welcome to the neoliberal university, but when I wake up at 1 a.m. every morning, my first thought is Steve is still dead. This is a life that is lived through the lens of death, knowing that there's nothing else, knowing that death is an absolute and complete waste. Now, there are millions of wounded people like me living in the shadows, carrying death with them as they walk through the world. We have so many zombie citizens who walk through the world, who work in our universities. We are broken people. We wake up every morning and wonder if we can bother living another day. Broken people. But you know what? Even a broken crayon continues to colour. It is a privilege to work in a university. It is a privilege to conduct research. It is a privilege to write. And that privilege is so great because we have lost so many great writers who died too early. How many words have we lost? But we have been given that gift of one more day. Therefore, let's carry Joan Didion with us on this Outrider journey and summon a year perhaps of magic, but let's hope of thinking and of magnificent writing. Let us think and read and write through that pain, through the horror, through the loss. Joan Didion matters to all of us who write because she focused energy and attention on sentences. Her sentences are stark, concise, and they're worth researching. She was such an outstanding writer because she respected words and she knew that words matter. When we read her work, it is like an intellectual sorbet. It cleans our palate. It cleans our mind. Just as music is created in the space between the notes, writing is created in the space between the words. Didion shows us that silence matters. Spaces matter. And it is true courage to summon words, to make sentences and make meaning from darkness, from space, and from silence. I wish you love, light, and peace. Tea out.